Hey everyone, George Christie here with Wine Industry Network. Welcome to another edition of the WIN Educational Webinar Series. Now today's session is sponsored and presented by Avalara, who offers a complete compliance solution for the beverage alcohol industry. And the title of the webinar is DTC Enforcement Trends in Beverage Alcohol. And really what's that, it's all really about the spike that we saw in direct consumer shipments as a result of COVID, and some of the things that we saw on the enforcement side as a result. So today's session is a roundtable discussion. We've got three compliance experts. It's hosted by Jeff Carroll. Jeff is the general manager of beverage alcohol with Avalara. His guests are Mary Beth Williams. Mary Beth is the president of Williams Compliance and Consulting Group, LLC, located outside of Richmond, or just outside of Richmond. And the third guest is Kristin Carlton, who's the director of compliance at Penrose Hill Winery, based in Napa. So they're going to share their experience, their expertise, and some of what they're seeing out there, obviously some advice. As is always the case, please take advantage of the chat feature. We pre-record these sessions. Primarily, we do that for quality reasons, right? We want to make sure we deliver a good quality product. But the other really good thing about it is that all the speakers are in the room taking those questions on as they come in. So instead of waiting till the very end for 5 or 10 minutes of Q&A, literally the whole session is really one big Q&A session. So submit those questions via the chat function. Like I said, we always hope to make these sessions as interactive as possible. Finally, I want to thank Avalara again. I want to thank everyone for their time. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I'm going to hand it off to Jeff and let him take it from here. Take it away, Jeff.
Thank you, George. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you to the Wine Industry Network for putting this program together today. I'm really excited to be joined by two true compliance experts. Kristin Carlton is Director of Compliance for Penrose Hill Winery. And Mary Beth Williams is the President of Williams Compliance and Consulting Group. Both have deep compliance experience, and I'm really excited to hear their thoughts on these important topics. Kristin and Mary Beth, thank you for being here. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Jeff.
We're going to talk about DTC enforcement trends today, with the goal really of helping you, the audience, understand what's going on and to navigate some of the compliance challenges that we're seeing. We don't have any slides. We're going to keep this very informal. And I think we have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to jump right in with some questions for the experts here. And this is a question that we get all the time here at Avalara. Which states have you heard of that are enforcing their laws? And let's say maybe over the last year or so. Mary Beth, let's start with you.
Well, I think that this is an area that everybody is enforcing. There's certainly a national trend towards enforcement of the DTC laws. I think there was a little bit more light that was shown on these issues through COVID, because there was so much more direct-to-consumer purchasing. So I think it is something that they have been highlighting more, or putting more of an emphasis on enforcement. But there certainly are some states that it's just higher on their priority list than others. And I mean, Texas, obviously, over the last couple of years, did their big rollout of looking to really do an audit of so many of the big shippers. Virginia is doing a pretty comprehensive one. New Hampshire was actually one of the first to really do enforcement actions, and they really sort of led that charge. And absolutely, the other states learned from New Hampshire, learned what was going on, and learned that there really was a problem and how to deal with it, or perceived problem. And yeah, I mean, I think it's something that all of them are looking at right now. There are some 3-tier industry pressures on the agencies to make this a priority and make sure that the sales that are happening in compliance with the law. So certainly there are some states that are more active in it, but I think that this is something that's a big national trend right now.
Definitely, because states talk to each other, and especially as you say, what is that? The 3-tier pressure. That was a nice way of putting that.
Thank
Mary
you.
Beth.
Thanks. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
That, there are wholesalers, the same wholesalers in different states, and those wholesalers, obviously, they're talking to each other. So, and then, there's not that many state legislators, so they are all talking to each other. They're all getting the same ideas, what worked in your state, what didn't work, so they're getting ideas from each other. But I would definitely say it's been a number of states. I mean, Michigan and Ohio, obviously.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Arizona.
Yep.
Has been, Missouri has been. Louisiana, right, exactly. South Dakota, even though that's not a huge population, they are very strict with their rules and they will enforce.
For sure. New York has been a big enforcement state.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that from a perspective standpoint, I think it's really helpful to understand why. Nobody wants to no state legislatures rather want to impose new taxes, right? That is not politically friendly. That doesn't do any politician any good right now. So what the states are trying to do, not just relative to DTC, but across the board, is figure out how better to generate additional income by enforcing existing laws. And so this is a prime candidate for that, and we were Kristin and I were at a meeting together, actually, a number of 5, 6, maybe longer than that, years ago. And the gentleman from New Hampshire was telling, that was really sort of when this stuff was busting out, and was talking about, these $500 fines that they were giving all of these wineries. And you could see every other regulator in the rooms, like, pop up, and their eyes got big, and the pens came out and notes started being taken. You start talking about all of these states that are having budget issues and saying, hey, your state, the guy from New Hampshire was talking about, by doing this initial enforcement rollout, he paid for his entire team's salary for the year. A state just can't ignore that, right? So you've got this 3-tier pressure, but you also have, there's just a financial piece to it too. And I think that we would be silly to ignore that. And that's just a reality of life today.
Yeah. And the other thing I'd add is during COVID, I think there were some relaxed regulations to allow businesses that were struggling to do some things that they weren't able to do in the past. And I think that was also an area of enforcement, like California, for example, allowed delivery, for certain types of establishments that didn't have it. And they did take a close look at enforcement, especially on delivery by unlicensed service providers, and really did find a high rate of non-compliance.
Yeah.
So that's a trend. So we're going to peel out, I think, some of the states that we mentioned. We're going to peel out Michigan and Ohio and talk about those 21st Amendment enforcement acts. We're going to talk about Texas separately. We're going to talk about Virginia separately. But Kristin, I guess back to you. So of those states that we talked about, those states that we listed, what are some of the themes that you're seeing? What are they actually enforcing, and how do they give notice to licensees?
I would definitely say volume limits is a big one. Actually, that seems to be one that's more enforced now. That's been my experience, and with talking with others in the industry, than it has previously. And then also like sort of wines of your own production, or wines that you have bottled or produced, or, just the language around that. Yep. And then of course, fulfillment warehouses, that's like the hot topic right now. So I don't know, Mary Beth, do you have any others?
No, those are the 3 biggies, I think, right now, for sure.
Yeah.
Great. So let's dig into the volume limits, Kristin. So how are states in enforcing that? What kind of penalties do we typically see? And let's dig into that volume limit question.
Well, I mean, let's face it, the volume limit is actually easy for them to track because we literally, the industry, we have to provide reports that say, shipment reports that say, here's how much they ship, here's how much we shipped. So all the states have to do is just look and see. It's easy for them. That's an easy thing for them to look. So especially say like reports that you have to file annually. Then they don't have to do any work. Then they just look and say, check this one, this one, this one, this one, so, and that's what they do. And it's been my experience, in talking to others and ourselves that roughly March, April, they'll send out inquiries. So,
yeah, I was going to ask about that.
I have to say that sometimes they don't get it right. And so it's important not to freak out. It's really important to get as much information from the states as you can before you respond or freak out. Like you need to ask them, okay, tell me which shipments, share with me. So,
and go check your own records too.
Exactly.
Because it's all entered, right? I mean, you've entered it. So if somebody meant to put that they sent 2 cases and they hit 0 twice, and it's just an error. It shows you sent 200 cases. So it's really easy to go into that and go, oh my gosh, I see exactly what you're talking about. And I'm so sorry. That should have been 2, not 20, or 20, not 200, or whatever the case might have been. And then you can go to them. You gotta imagine that they, people get defensive about this stuff. So if you can kind of self-check, you get that message from the state, you can go in and self-check and just make sure there's nothing that's obviously messed up. Then you can go to them kind of with your hat in your hand, and they're going to appreciate that, because nobody wants to fight with every single person that they talk to. So if you can go and say, thanks for your message. I got thanks for your love letter. I got your love letter, and I checked, and I absolutely see what you're looking at. And I've gone back and I've checked with our people, and that should have been this different number. What kind of information can I provide to you to support the fact that was just a typographical error? And then that puts you on their good guy list right out of the gate, because you've been really easy to get along with.
Right, totally. I mean, this is so important. You've got to be friendly to these people. Honestly, the people that you get the initial reach out from, they're just doing their job.
Yep.
They, somebody else told them, go out and check this stuff. They might not even understand. They just know, like, oh, I have to check this stuff. And then they're just doing their job. So to your point, Mary Beth, just being friendly with them and offering to help. What can I do? Can you get, this is a business transaction here, so let's work together. So it's super important, and you will get a much better response from them if you're actually friendly.
Absolutely.
So,
yep.
Yeah. The other obvious thing that regulators do is cross-check reports. Cross-check what you've said you submitted, and then they cross-check what the fulfillment houses that they have to report, what they've said, and what FedEx has submitted. That seems like much harder for me, but certainly there are states that have figured out how to do that cross-checking easily. So
yeah, I was gonna what you said earlier was interesting, Kristin, where you said a lot of these notices come in the kind of the March, April time frame after the annual reports were filed. So I was wondering if you see, because I think oftentimes FedEx and UPS, they might actually submit like more of a monthly report depending on the state. So do you see that a combination there where it's both based on the reports that you submitted, but also they're kind of actively monitoring the FedEx and UPS reports?
Some, yeah, for sure. Some of them,
and I think it's state by state as well. I mean, I think there are some states that rely much more heavily on those common carrier reports for that cross-checking. I think it's really important. I think there are a lot of people that don't realize that they literally are going in and saying, okay, we have an invoice that went from this winery on this day. The FedEx report is showing that. Do we show that same transaction on the winery's report? And it is that detailed. So I think it really depends on which states rely on which information more heavily.
Mm-hmm.
The states that do require the annual reports, absolutely, March and April are the months, because that's just when they've had time to process through and really see where the gaps are. My opinion, and I think that it varies again state by state, but I tend to think that with the monthly reports, you see generally 8 to 12 week lag between when the shipments were versus when they're saying, hey, we've got a problem. So they're not going to say, hey, we see that maybe they will, but overall, I think they're not going to come back and say, hey, there was a problem 10 days ago. That's just not, it's just not that quick of a turnaround. I think the states really do try to make sure that they aren't making, false accusations, that they are actually cross-checking that information and doing the best due diligence that they can before they send you the love letter that says, hey, guess what you did or didn't do. So I think it really, you get all kinds of different dates throughout the year.
So, and picking up on a few of the comments from earlier. So when you get these letters, you said don't panic, but I'm curious about what you typically see, Mary Beth, I guess, from your clients. If are states fairly lenient on the first offense? Does it depend on the state, and how does that escalate?
Yeah, I think it depends on the state. It's and I think unfortunately that's just alcohol. That's going to be the answer on every single question on anything that has to do with alcohol. It depends on the state. There are some states that you get the letter that says you shipped, you don't have a license, you need to pay $500. There is no there will be a hearing, there isn't a due process kind of situation unless you ask for it. And if you say we did not and demand a hearing or something like that, then obviously you get that due process. But that the initial love letter is really, and that's kind of what makes it scary, right? Is that you get this thing that says you did this, pay up. And you feel like you don't really have the ability to defend yourself. So in those situations, if it's just not the case, obviously you call the agency first and try to discuss it. And if they're like, I am looking at the FedEx report and it says you did, then, you need to try to do some kind of forensic work on your own. But that's when you ask for hearing and you say, we didn't do what's being alleged. And then there are other ones that say, hey, you know what? It looks like maybe a shipment didn't get reported. And you can usually tell in the language in the letter kind of how they're going to deal with it. So they're like, it looks like perhaps a shipment didn't get reported. Can you check your records and see if there was an oversight? And so those are the ones that are going to be like, don't do it again. And so long as you don't do it again, you're all right. So it really, you can generally tell how they're going to approach it from the tenor of the letter.
Yeah. And I've seen, you mentioned the $500 fine, that I've seen states come out with a letter like that, first offense, and that's per shipment.
Per shipment.
So if you accidentally made 5 shipments at $500,
Yikes.
it starts to add up pretty quickly, right?
Indeed.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Moving on, Kristin, you mentioned the wines not of your own production. That definitely feels like a trend. I think that it's been in the laws in most of the states that have either passed new laws or changed their laws. I think we saw that recently in Kentucky and Tennessee, adding those in. And then I don't remember if it's in Alabama's bill, but I assume that it probably is. So let's talk a little bit more about that wines of your own production issue and what you're seeing there.
Here's the thing. When those laws are written, it's all interpretation. What does production mean? There's so many forms of production. What if which a huge part of the industry does custom bottling, where you don't have the space at your facility, so you send your wine somewhere else to get bottled. Well, then what is that? The cola will be the other facility, but the states don't really understand. They just look at the cola and say, oh, it's somebody else, it's a different cola, right? So I think it's important to really look at every state. I mean, it's burdensome, but to really look at it and sort of, and if you need to get legal counsel involved to understand, like, what does that state mean by production? Because it's not clear what it is. Is production fermentation? Is production bottling? Is it, what is production? And it's confusing for sure. And I think, when states are sort of cracking down on that, they don't really have a clear definition of it either. So,
and it seems to me, and it certainly has been, particularly on the East Coast where I'm based, it has absolutely been a huge trend in the states. And I think what the states are trying to do is prevent wineries from becoming retailers. That's the idea, is that they're trying to prevent you from going, I'm just going to ship everybody all these different wines, any wines that I want to ship. And so more of them, like Maryland is a great example. Until 2 years ago, there still isn't product registration in Maryland, but now each year with your Maryland renewal, you have to send them a list of products that you produce and that you will be shipping into the state. Well, that never used to happen. So, I mean, I think a lot of these laws are coming from situations, and we'll talk a little bit more about this with the 21st Amendment Enforcement Act stuff, where you have people that are pushing the boundaries. And so you have the states going, wait a minute, we got to tighten the language so that we're clear on what people are able to do. And I think, so many of the states had very gray language before, and now they're trying to tighten it up. But I think a lot of the states do realize that custom crush is a thing, custom bottling, or contract bottling is a thing. So they're trying to leave it broad enough that it allows for, I'll call, legitimate production functions to happen, and still allow that winery to basically say, that's still your wine, that it's still your wine. You're not acting as a retailer for somebody else's wine, but how do we do that? And I think that's really the struggle that we're seeing right now, is what language is that? I mean, Texas's issue is not a production issue, it's a bottling issue, which in my opinion makes it a lot more complicated, because you're right. I mean, people, somebody will hire a mobile bottler and have them out there for a week, and other people bring their wines over, and everything is bottled on one winery's site, which means that the cola then has to be sent by then. So, what kind of paperwork do you need to have in place and ready to produce to show that this was produced for me under a contract, still my product? It just really an economics issue that forced the contract bottling rather than everybody buying their own bottling line.
Right.
So
exactly.
when you say companies pushing the boundaries, I mean, we're not going to name any names here, obviously, but are you're referring to I'm assuming you're referring to the scenario where companies might kind of offer their licenses, but basically kind of lease out their licenses and let other wineries participate effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be as big as that, or it can be as little as, the winery down the street doesn't have a license into that state. So, hey, I've got somebody that wants to buy 2 cases of wine. That's a big sale for us. I know you have a license into that state. Can you ship it under your license? I mean, I think it can be anything as really innocuous as that, to something that really your entire business model is shipping other people's wine. So, I think it really is the full spectrum, and I don't think anybody's saying there's any sort of nefarious intent or anything like that, but it is people, pushing those boundaries. And if we go back again to that why that we talked about earlier, let's use Maryland. Maryland's a $200 a year license fee. They don't want 27 wineries to use one license fee, right? I mean, it's a revenue thing. Right. It also gives them control to make sure that the products that are coming in are legit to be sold in the state. So,
Right.
It's just, there are a number of reasons that these things are happening, but this is not happening for no reason, right? There certainly
Right.
is a basis behind it.
Yeah.
And the harder people push, and this is just kind of the natural dynamic, the harder people push those boundaries, the more the states push back. And that's just,
Sure.
that's kind of what we're seeing.
Sure.
And I will say that I've seen this where a retailer in a state will peruse and file complaints. And then once a complaint's filed, the state has to respond to it.
That's right.
So,
Yep.
That makes sense.
That's very valid. And that's happens more often than I think people think, that,
For sure.
an in-state retailer is sort of they're sort of self-enforcing almost the industry. So.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, let's keep it moving here. So we mentioned earlier this issue of fulfillment house enforcement and licensing. I don't know if we need to spend a ton of time here, but that definitely is a trend with Tennessee and Alabama recently creating new fulfillment house licenses. Kansas looks likely to do so, and then Kentucky didn't create a license, but specifically kind of allowed fulfillment houses. So and there is a debate about the constitutionality of that and that kind of thing, but kind of putting those things aside, what's your practical advice for wineries, for example, about dealing with fulfillment houses in these states?
I mean, I certainly think it's important for wineries to check who they're dealing with. And, who are you contracting with as a fulfillment house?
Yep.
And you can't always just take their word for it, or if the website says, yeah, we have the licenses to ship for you, they don't.
Right.
They don't. I'm
Right.
sorry. I love it that Steve Gross always, is pounding that.
Yeah.
You really have to be diligent in who you're doing business with, honestly, because a legitimate fulfillment house will get the licenses that they
Sure.
need to get. They want to stay in business.
Yep.
So. And honestly, also the common carriers are really cracking down a lot, really checking licenses. And so they're going to do the same. They're going to check fulfillment house licenses as well. So.
Yeah.
I think the things
Mary Beth?
Yeah, I mean, the things I think that you can do are obviously, as Kristin said, ask to see the licenses. Say, we like to have a copy of those in our files as well. If they've got them, they're going to provide them. If they're real reticent or squirrely about providing them, they probably don't have them.
Red flag.
And big red flag. And then, one of the things that Virginia's got fulfillment warehouse, a fulfillment warehouse requirement or ability within DTC. But that's where a tremendous number, when they were just going through and checking licenses versus common carrier reports, I mean, they were coming back with it just made your head want to fall off. It was 70% of all direct to consumer transactions in Virginia were being done illegally, was the number that they threw out originally. And we were like, there's no way that's right. There's no way. And what was happening was that so many of these shipments were coming from fulfillment houses, but the wineries had not provided to the state, as is required by the state, a copy of the addendum, giving them a second license. The other thing to check is make sure that the address that the addresses are correct. And it seems like a very kind of administrative, nonsensical kind of thing, but there are not enough people that work at these agencies for them to humanly, individually be going through and going, okay, well, that says 100 Elm Street, and that says 100 West Elm Street. So that's totally the same thing. They're just running these things through a computer program, and if they don't match, they don't match. So, making sure that when you're inputting data into your reports, that it is correct will actually help a lot as well. Making sure that the address is correct, including things like suite numbers. Sometimes you'll have, at a lot of these big warehouses, you'll have, multiple street addresses that are used. And so, you may have your contract with your fulfillment warehouse may be 100 West Elm, but their shipping address may be 120 East Main or something, because they take up a huge block or something. Right. So just check that kind of stuff as well, because again, it goes back to, you get this love letter that scares the bejesus out of you. And it's actually a completely valid transaction, but because of just some sort of human error, it looks like something's wrong. So, eliminate as much of that human error as you possibly can. And then there's less panic, less blood pressure spikes that go on with this stuff.
Are you suggesting that people use some kind of an automated software product that automatically does address validation and checks volume limits and something like that?
Does such a thing exist?
Yeah, I think something does exist. There's this product called Avalara shipping verification that does all of that.
Your marketing team is very happy right now, Jeff.
It makes a huge difference to have that sort of double check done, because it just takes out an entire section of errors. And if you're thinking about it again from the regulator side, if they're looking at your report and there are 40 line items on your report that are not matching up with common carrier reports, you look like a bad actor. You look like somebody that is a complete scofflaw. What a good word to use in a sentence. Yay me, that's my word for the day. You are a complete scofflaw. You don't care what the rules are. You're going to do whatever you want. And that focuses that attention on you. And nobody wants that attention. That's bad attention. So having something like that goes through and just eliminates those ones that are just fumble fingered, that really puts the highlight on the things that really need to be dealt with. So it's a fine product.
All right, let's move on. So one of the big headlines that I think people have been reading about are the 21st Amendment Enforcement Act cases in Ohio and Michigan. Mary Beth, I'm going to stay with you on this one. Can you just give us a quick overview of what that's about, and then let's talk about whether or not we think that trend might actually continue.
You bet. Apology for the canine uprising that happened there for a moment. So the 21st Amendment Enforcement Act is, it actually was enacted in 2000. So, it's been around for a long time and just really hasn't been used. So obviously the 21st Amendment was the amendment that repealed prohibition and gave the ability to the states to regulate the sale of alcohol within their states. And ultimately, it's the source of all of these direct-to-consumer shipping licenses and all of the licensing protocol in all of the states. So it's last year, 2 states, first Ohio and then Michigan, filed the first actions using the 21st Amendment Enforcement Act as the basis of their actions. And one of the things that's always been a real problem for states in enforcement is if you didn't have a license, they didn't have a hook into you, right? So they were, they call them long arm statutes, and anybody that does business in the state can go after you. But it's a pretty belabored process. So this 21st Amendment Enforcement Act really gave injunctive relief, which means that they can say, stop it and stop it now. It doesn't give them any kind of fining ability in and of itself, which sort of made it feel very ineffective or weak to begin with. But most states have got an injunction enforcement act that then imposes penalties. So they can go after you and get the personal jurisdiction on somebody that's not licensed. So if you get licensed in a state, you are granting personal jurisdiction to that state to enforce the laws against you. But if you are not licensed, you haven't granted that personal jurisdiction. So there were always some real enforcement challenges. And so what the 21st Amendment Enforcement Act does is allow state attorneys general who normally just can file actions that are violations of state law. It gives them a federal course of action to enforce this act. So really, and if you look at some of the complaints, if you have insomnia or just a super geek or something, if you just, hey, I think my weekend plans I'll look at all the enforcement actions. The complaints themselves are really, you were selling product into our state. You're not licensed to do that. Stop it. And that's really, they're very short, very, very to the point. And that's kind of the whole idea, is that they're able to say, no, knock it off. And there have been big actions against big online retail, online retailers. Some of these people that were doing like the online cocktail kits that have been a thing, or some of the true retailers, and their mode of business prior to these injunctions had sort of been saying, we're based in California, so you are making your purchase under California law, and then you are hiring us to have that shipped to you as a favor to you, or as a contract to you. So they were trying to say all of this is happening under California law.
The passage of title.
Correct, the passage of title. So really what the 21st Amendment Enforcement Act kind of did away with that and said, you know what, we're not playing that game. That's not what's supposed to be happening, and you're going to stop it. So so far we have not had any that have gone all the way through hearing, and I wouldn't expect us to. They've all ended in consent decrees, which means we'll stop going after you if you stop being a bad actor. There have been some things, there are definitely commonalities in them. One being, you stop selling into our state, you stop advertising that you can sell into our state, and you train your people that you can't sell into our state. Some of them have required that, there be specific tags, bold tags, I guess is the best way to put it, that just says, please note that we are not allowed to ship into the state of Ohio or the state of Michigan. So there are affirmative actions in some of these consent decrees, but for the most part, it's knock it off. There has been at least one consent decree in Ohio where they are, this online retailer is going to get a physical presence in the state. They're going to get an in-state license, which then allows them to apply for the S license, which is the shipping license. And the interesting thing, and this kind of goes back to Kristin's comment earlier about the retailers looking at this stuff. I mean, if you think about who really suffers the most from the direct to consumer, it's the retailers, right? Because if you couldn't get that bottle of wine shipped to you, you would go to your local store and buy it. I mean, that's the trade-off. So in Ohio, in particular, there was a companion civil action brought by a bunch of the out-of-state retailers, rather, saying, wait, we can't get a license there. Like, we can't ship to you guys. And so that's not fair. Kind of going back into the Tennessee action and some of these Granholm-based actions that we've seen over the last few years. So you're seeing more and more of that in the Michigan case. So there were no penalties in the Ohio cases. They just decided they were just going to leave it at an injunction and at training and remedial measures. And then Michigan took it another step further and said, and we're going to give you a penalty. It was a $10,000 penalty, not a huge penalty, but enough that, it makes somebody think. So that I think that's probably, I think that's a tool in their arsenal that we're going to see more states use, because it's something that they can do very quick.
I was going to ask that. So maybe Kristin, back to you real quick, and then we'll move on to our last topic. So Michigan and Ohio both had their initial rounds. Now Michigan has a second round of these cases. Do we think that other states are going to follow suit with this type of thing? Okay.
And I think Sean O'Leary, I saw him talking last week. He was saying it seems that it's going to be in the Sixth Circuit, because that's in those states, because those are the Sixth Circuit is sort of defending that.
Mhm.
what the
Where
state's
that Lebamoff case was. Yeah, that makes
Right.
sense. Yep.
right.
Yep.
So,
And we know these states talk to each other, as you guys suggested, and
Yep.
the three of us will probably be at the NCSLA conference,
Right.
and I'm sure
Yeah.
this topic will come
There's
up.
only 50 state regulators, and 50 state
Yeah,
attorney generals.
Mhm.
right.
That's
So,
right.
So let's move on to Texas real quick. So I think the original plan was for Texas to audit all 1,600 of their winery shipping licensees. I don't know if either of you want to provide some. I mean, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what they're trying to accomplish. Number one, and then number two, kind of what's the practical advice for for dealing with this audit. Kristin, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think there was a big change of hands in Texas a couple of years ago. And so the new leadership came in and they decided, I think that they decided, hey, this is the thing that we're going to do, obviously not knowing that COVID was coming up, but, so then they said, okay, we're going to, audit all of these wineries. I think that they didn't realize what they had bit off. Honestly, they bit off way more than they could chew. I think if you haven't been audited yet, and you do get the love letter, they're asking for a lot of data.
Yeah.
A lot of data. And honestly, they have the right to ask for it. I mean, it's actually in the regulations. They've got the right to ask for it. They ask for invoice copies. They ask for years worth of data, as many years as they can get. The thing is that they also don't have the technical capabilities to receive that data. So it's been, my experience and some experience with others in the industry, getting them the data that they need is very difficult.
And they also don't have the personnel to review all of that data once they get it. Right. So there are multiple levels of challenge from a regulatory perspective, I think, as far as moving forward with it.
Right, exactly. And so, so expect also the other thing is that they give, when you receive the letter, you have a very limited time to provide them the data, like 2 weeks. So it's perfectly acceptable. And I think even the people in the state would say it's perfectly acceptable to ask for an extension on that time. Get back to them right away and say, hey, I'm happy to get you all of this information. It's going to take longer than 2 weeks. And ask for a reasonable extension. I mean, don't ask for a year, but I think it's perfectly acceptable to ask for 2 to 4 weeks extension.
Okay.
And as long as you're working with them, I think that they'll accept that. So, yeah. I mean, and the same thing, like be friendly to them. They're just doing their jobs.
That's always important.
Right, exactly. So
if you ask them, and not necessarily specific to Texas, but if somebody asks you for a big data dump like that, you can, the letter, it's just a form letter, right? So the form letter says the exact same thing. So it cannot hurt to ask, to go back to the state and say, do you really need that information for 3 years? You want all that information? I mean, is there a period within there that you're specifically looking at or something like that? And a lot of times they'll go, let's pick a couple of months. So let's pick 1 month at the beginning, 1 month in the middle, and 1 month at the end of that 3-year period. And at least that gives you, that knocks some of the information out. They may say all of it for 3 years. But they're not going to ding you for asking, but never, ever, ever, ever ignore it. Like it is not going away.
Correct.
Right, exactly. That would be the worst thing
that would be a bad thing to do.
So, yeah. And also those letters sometimes can be so scary because in certain states, I think Virginia is one of them, they're actually officers. So it will say like officer such and such.
Yep.
That does really make it seem more scary and like you kind of freeze like, oh no, but that's just their title. Investigator and officer, that's just their title. So just, yeah.
Let's use that. That's a good segue. So let's move on to Virginia. Mary Beth, you're an expert in Virginia. Tell us what's going on there and what kind of advice you have for people that are licensed in Virginia.
the good news, since we've been talking about it, is I think we've actually talked about most of the Virginia things. The fulfillment warehouse addresses, Virginia has a unique little twist on it, is in that shipments can only originate from the licensed address, right? And so if you leave out the East in the name or something like that, or if it's coming from the fulfillment warehouse or something along those lines, it becomes really problematic. I will say that this is absolutely a priority, an enforcement priority for them. It did sort of slip down the priority list through COVID, as they worked really hard, as did most of the states, to figure out ways to help licensees remain in business through all of the COVID shutdown. And so this sort of fell down that priority list a little bit, but yeah, I mean, it's absolutely ramping back up. They are looking very carefully at it. One of the things that they've been really working on is finding the technology to make this not such a manual, laborious kind of process, to be able to take these common carrier records and really like run them against, through some sort of computer program, run them against all of these winery shipper monthly reports. And one of the things that at least I recommend for my clients is, again, and it goes to just removing those low-hanging fruit. Like, if your shipment shows that it's going out in May, but it's actually not picked up by FedEx until June 2nd. So you guys pack up your wine club on May 30th, but it doesn't get picked up until June 2nd. It's not going to show up on the same month report necessarily. Like it may show up on your winery May report, and it's going to show up on FedEx's June report. So is it the end of the world? Can you go and say, oh gosh, it showed up on the June report? But boy, if you don't have to talk to the regulators, don't talk to the regulators. The less interaction and the less you can get on their radar, the better. So, I mean, to the extent that you all can make shipments happen not at the beginning, end of a month where they're potentially going on different reports. It's just better. I mean, it's just eliminating the things that look questionable.
The other thing that's happened when they're cross-checking reports, sometimes when states do that, is if a shipment is redirected mid-shipment.
For sure.
So, and that can cause some issues as well. So
for sure,
not the end of the world, but it does happen when they're matching sort of those two. So
absolutely.
Okay, I want to move on to one last topic. I think we have just a few minutes, and that is the rise of marketplaces and delivery apps. And I think that's pretty big news these days in the industry because of the announcement of Uber's plans to acquire Drizzly, and then also other companies like Vivino raising boatloads of money to accelerate. And it seems like more and more people are choosing to participate in those platforms, and that accelerated during COVID, obviously. And I'll just start with a few thoughts on that. I mean, number one, it's really important if you're a winery or you're a retailer and you're choosing to participate with one of these providers, right? Sometimes known as third-party providers or TPPs. Read the contract and understand the program. Right. I think that's really important, because at the end of the day, in almost every case, you are responsible. You're responsible for their actions. And so make sure that you understand how the money flows. Make sure you understand how they're representing your wines. Are you in control of kind of the placement? And is it clear to the buyer that you're the licensee? And some of those fine details, right, end up being incredibly important. So read the fine print, understand the program, ask as many questions as you can, and just remember that you are ultimately responsible for their actions. So also monitor how that program is going. You guys want to add anything about participating in marketplaces or delivery apps?
No, I mean, it's obviously the way of the future, right? I mean, it's going to get bigger, not smaller. And, you would definitely behoove yourself to pay attention to this and keep up to speed as it's growing. rather than trying to drink from the fire hose once it's like the ginormous thing that it's going to become.
Right.
Yeah, and just keeping track of the taxes seems, that's
absolutely.
really something to keep your eyes on, and who's paying the taxes. You have to make sure, like, don't make assumptions that someone else is going to pay the taxes for you. So
correct.
And I would
even
probably,
if they have to. Yeah.
That's right. I would probably also, I would want there to be in a contract rather, that my clients had with one of these marketplace providers. I would want there to be some sort of communication so that I knew I had a monthly or quarterly, depending on how that state requires tax payment, that some sort of confirmation that payment had been made. Because as you said, it's going to come back to me. It's not, it's going to come back to the winery. It's not going to come back to the marketplace person. They're acting as the winery's agent. So if they're acting as your agent in the same way as anybody else that worked for you, you would want some sort of confirmation that they had done their job. So, I check those kinds of things in the contract. And if it's not in the contract, it doesn't mean you can't ask. You can ask for that kind of stuff still. So
your default assumption should be that you're responsible for paying taxes as the licensee. There's going to be a few scenarios where, I guess since 2018 in the Wayfair Supreme Court decision, almost all states now have some kind of Marketplace Facilitator Act that might actually mandate that the marketplace registers just for the sales tax piece, right? So they might actually have an obligation to collect and remit the sales tax, but you need to know that to both of your points, right? If they are registered, make sure that they're doing that. And you need, in some states, even if they're paying the tax, you actually need to report the tax on your sales tax return and list it as an exempt transaction bucket. So you need those details, and you have the right to those details. And so make sure that they give you a full accounting of everything that happened when your license was used for the transaction.
Absolutely.
And can I just throw in one more last thing just about sales tax in general? Now that so many people are remote and, companies are hiring from all over the country, that might actually come into play the physical nexus aspect. And especially, you can't, if you have physical nexus, then you don't qualify for SST, that sort of thing. But also, there could be local physical nexus.
Yes.
So, and you might be required then to pay local sales taxes in a particular state or region. So just if, as people are hiring remotely, and I think so many companies, even wineries, are, hiring remotely. So just to pay attention to that, because it's something I don't think a lot of people think about. So
it's a great point. I mean, I live in Colorado, and Colorado is a home rule state. There's a lot of home rule jurisdictions. So if you have an employee in one of those jurisdictions, you actually need a separate permit with that city or county. If they're a home rule, and then you need to separately kind of pay taxes to that home rule jurisdiction. Right. And we've been seeing that more and more. It's a really good point, Kristin.
Yep.
And I'm sure that Avalara can help you with that, right, Jeff?
That taxes are our specialty. We can absolutely help with state and home rule jurisdiction. And we can get you the permits and do the
plug-in for you.
Thank you. Okay, well, this has been a lot of fun. Any last words? Any last words, Mary Beth or Kristin?
No.
Just thank you. This has been really great. So
thank you so much for participating. This has been great. Thanks to the Wine Industry Network for having us. And thank you all for joining. Have a great day.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.